The latest is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, is likely to be in Panama in the next few days. But the Panamanian government has been completely adamant that what Trump is saying is, i.e., that he wants to take back the canal, is totally out of the question. Although they want to continue with good relations, Panama, has long been a bit of a U.S. ally in this region, so it doesn't want a complete break. But as I say, no question that what Trump and the Trump administration is saying here in Panama has gone down pretty badly, because they are absolutely clear that this canal is part of Panama and is Panamanian.
Well, take us through then the history of the Panama Canal and how it came to be such a crucial trade route.
Well, it's a history that goes back more than a century. The effort to build a canal, in fact, goes back several centuries. It was in the 16th century that Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, looked at one of the early maps of the Americas and thought, there is a shortcut from Europe really to his empire in Peru. A survey was done, and it was quickly discovered that, of course, building a canal at that time with the technology at the time was completely impossible. So it was towards the end of the 19th century that the world again looked at the possibility of building a canal, and it was really driven by France, specifically Ferdinand Essops, who a French diplomat turned canal builder. He was behind the successful build of the Suez Canal, and he said, and he and his team looked at the rest of the world and saw Panama as another opportunity to build a waterway uniting two oceans. A lot of money was raised in France to build that canal. A lot of people were hired, mainly from the British Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica specifically. They came here, and it soon became a complete disaster, because the one factor they hadn't really factored in was tropical diseases, and thousands of people died from both yellow fever and malaria. I think it was around 400 people died for every 1,000 workers during a decade of attempts to build this canal. And they were also sort of following the model of Suez, which was a canal without locks, just a straight waterway, which means you have to build a much deeper channel. And that impeded them. That was a sort of design flaw that was never going to work. Towards the end of that French effort, when they were running out of money, they realized that the way to do this was a canal with locks. But by then it was too late, because they'd lost so many workers and they lost so much money. So what happened then was the Americans, you've got to bear in mind, end of the 19th century, the United States was this sort of emerging superpower. It had a good look at the canal and the French project and decided this was a feasible project. It made an offer to the French to buy what remained of their effort for $40 million. But there was another problem, and that was Panama then was part of Colombia, and the Colombian government was not really up for doing a deal to build a canal, or certainly not one which would end up being a U.S. territory effectively. So what the Americans did was they backed a rebellion in Panama. You've got to bear in mind, Panama is somewhat separated from Colombia. What's quite famous in the news at the moment, the Darien Gap, this sort of jungled, rocky, mountainous area between Colombia and Panama. That's pretty much impassable. So Panama was a sort of separate province anyway. The US backed a rebellion. It succeeded. It then did a deal with the new government saying, right, we'll build the canal, and when it's built, the canal zone, either side of that canal, will be effectively US territory. And of course, the new government accepted that. So a deal was done, and Teddy Roosevelt was the president of the United States while that arrangement was being made. And interestingly, he's this sort of somewhat swashbuckling president from a century ago, and someone who Trump has expressed his admiration for. So there is a sort of theory that Trump thinks himself as the new Roosevelt. They're obviously very different characters, but that's part of it. So eventually, in 1913, the canal was built, one of the great engineering triumphs of the 20th century. And actually, the people I've been speaking to people all over Panama about this for the last week. And one of the things that you do hear from engineers is the quality of the building in the sort of first decade of the 20th century was quite extraordinary because, there's still the same walls are there and it worked. The sort of clever system they had of a dammed lake in the middle to provide the water for the locks, that system was extremely effective. So there we are. That's how the canal was built. But since then, there's been a lot more history since then, of course.
And so, what's the modern history of it? How did it come to then leave US hands and go back to Panama?
Yeah, so as we go through the 20th century, the canal very quickly it was really mainly designed. One of the sort of incentives for it was a military one. This was the United States was expanding as an empire. It had Puerto Rico on the Atlantic side or the Caribbean side of the canal, but it had Hawaii and other territories in the Pacific. And it wanted to be able to unite those two. So as I say, the main incentive was to be able to sort of unite the growing American empire. But once it was built, it actually soon became apparent just what a commercial jackpot it was providing. Particularly, actually, not so much international trade, but national domestic trade within the United States. A whole lot of oil had been discovered in California. And meanwhile, the cities on the east coast of the United States, New York, obviously the most prominent one, were boom towns. And getting what you needed from one side to the other turned out to be much cheaper to take it by boat through this US-operated canal to the other side. So this was a huge boom for the United States. But of course, what Panamanians began to notice was the boom wasn't really coming their way. So they had this very obvious big cut through their territory, the canal, but the money wasn't really getting there. And as we went through the 20th century, particularly post the Second World War, where anti-colonialism became more and more of an issue, quite prominently, of course, the Suez Canal was nationalized. The British territories in the Caribbean were becoming independent. So a sort of independence movement in Panama grew, and one of the targets of that movement was the canal. The Panamanians who wanted the canal back, they were particularly upset by the fact that Americans who were living in the canal zone, which is still really obvious here, you see this sort of different architecture, this different place where the Americans had control. The Americans there were living sort of comfortable lives with everything working perfectly, and obviously sort of plenty of money. Well, they weren't sort of necessarily rich Americans living there. Many of them were sort of people working on the canal. But the sort of difference between life on the canal zone and life outside it became increasingly an irritant. And in 1964, a bunch of Panamanians tried to raise the Panamanian flag inside the canal zone. The U.S. Marines resisted. Several Panamanians were killed. Some Americans were killed. And then, that was really what made the United States begin to think, times have changed. We possibly will need to think about handing this back.
And what has happened since that agreement was made? And of course, the US did eventually leave.
Yes, so that whole process took a lot. So in 1977, Jimmy Carter was president, and he signed a deal to hand back the canal by the end of the 20th century, by January the 31st, 1999. It was a very complicated process. You're basically handing over the sovereignty of a country from one to another, and all sorts of logistical issues. it looked like it wasn't going to work particularly in '89 when the US invaded for a rather separate issue to try and boot out and capture Noriega, which was a success. Um, but eventually, as time went by, yes, that handover did happen. But the one thing sort of that's relevant to bear in mind now is during that process, a lot of conservatives in the United States, Republicans particularly, thought that Jimmy Carter had done a bad deal and that the United States was retreating from a position that its destiny was to have. It had, you know, done this incredible breakthrough of building the canal. Why on earth should you hand it back? So there was a bit of resistance. And of course, Trump, at that time in the 70s, he would have been a 30-year businessman in his 30s. He was one of the people who sort of read the articles in the papers thinking, what a terrible deal. So that was in the back of his mind, I think, for much of his life. But it was handed over on the 31st of December, 1999. And Panama has took it over and has run it ever since and has also expanded it. So that's the other thing I've been hearing from Panamanians here, officials, government officials, one ex-president I spoke to. They said, the United States says it wants the canal back, but the canal it handed us was quite different from the one we now have. We have spent $5 billion, half of it Panamanian government money, the other half raised by international banks. This is a huge project. And one Panamanian business guy said to me, it's a bit like you sell a house, you sell a plot of land with a little cottage on it, and then someone builds a hotel, and then you come back and say, actually, we want that back. So they're saying, look, if you want anything back, A, it's not going to happen, and B, we are talking about a very different project than the one that was handed over right at the end of the last century.
And Trump's big claim to it and argument is that China have taken over the Panama Canal. What's the truth behind that claim?
No, it's basically not true in terms of what he is saying in terms of their operating it. The Panama Canal Authority totally operates this. There are no Chinese in the sort of control room. There are ships from all over the world going through the canal, Chinese, American, Malaysian, whatever, and they all abide by the same rules. And no, it's definitely operated by the Panamanian government. The problem is that there are two ports on either end of the canal that were privatized during the handover process. The Panamanian government said, right, we're going to have these. We've suddenly got these two ports that were sort of American ports. Now they're going to be ours. What are we going to do with them? We're going to privatize them. That happened in 1997. And by making a very generous bid, the then Hong Kong-based company, C.K. Hutchinson, got control of those two ports, which it has to this day. Now, Hong Kong is now much more obviously part of China, so that has started the feeling that the Chinese control part of the canal. They don't control the canal, really. They do, however, have a presence in those two ports. But I've been to both ports. You don't see a whole lot of any Chinese signs outside. You don't see Chinese workers in the local canteens. It is owned by a Chinese company, but it's a sort of a conglomerate that owns it. And here in Panama, as I said, there's no sort of really obvious evidence of the Chinese sort of really dominating the entrance to the port, to the canal via those two ports, but it has become a bit of a sticking point for the United States and others.
And what does Panama say about this situation? I mean, as you've said at the start of this interview, they're not happy about the situation.
No, they don't. Obviously, no, they don't like being told that the canal that they feel they've run very efficiently and very profitably is somehow Chinese and they're making a mess of it and they should hand us all back to the United States. But there is a little sort of detail of this, and that is a lot of the Panamanians I've spoken to have said, well, if the United States want to somehow edge China out of that port, i.e. edge the company that runs that port out, We don't necessarily have a problem with that if that's a solution. This one thing interesting about Panama is it's actually a very sort of culturally, it's very close to the United States. It's because of this history, it's and it's sort of pro-American in many ways. I mean, Panama City, where I'm speaking to you now, it's a bit of a mini Miami. A lot of people speak Spanglish, mix fat Spanish and English. There's not a sort of we hate the United States feeling generally going on. Obviously, there's some people who might feel that. So there is an opportunity to get a bit closer to the US, but whether that's going to work with this sort of name calling, etc., is complicated. But there's not a whole lot of feeling of no, those ports are run. If we sort of take the shortcut and say those are run by the Chinese, there's not a great feeling of saying yes, that's right, and so they should be for forever. There is possibly a opportunity for negotiation there.
Well, on that, I'd like to quote from your article in the Times, Walter Luxinger, president of the US Panama Business Council, saying, "Pay us and we will get rid of the Chinese." That sort of sentiment is surely music to Trump's ears. I mean, the man who likes to be seen as the deal maker in chief, right?
Yes, I mean, and culturally, Trump in many, the Panama business community is quite Trumpian in a way. This is a very capitalist country. A lot, everyone's up to do a deal about anything. And the point the businessman there was really making was, look, the whole thing's commercial. That the Chinese or the CK Hutchison have control, legally of those two ports. That was part of a bidding process. Now, if you want to break that contract, any contract can be broken. It costs you. There's going to be a legal cost to that, and the other side will sue. And he was saying, if that's how you want to play it, it might cost you $200 million in a sort of fine, but we're up for that. So yeah, I mean, Trump, of course, as you say, yeah, this is an environment he should thrive in. Of course, it is worth pointing out something else, and that he does have history in Panama. There's an enormous skyscraper here overlooking the Pacific that was once called the Trump Ocean Club. It was a long and rather complicated process with the Trump organization, but basically they licensed their name to that building. Then the whole thing went badly wrong. The guy who built the building went bankrupt, and eventually the Trump name was taken off that building. And there's another theory that maybe Trump, feels a bit of a grudge against sort of Panama and wants to get his own back big time, not just have the hotel, but have the canal. Don't know how much truth there is in it, but he's got history here, and I've spoken again, sort of to a lot of people in the business community, and some of them have met Trump and have had dealings with him and sort of tell the stories of what happened during that hotel process. He also, there was a Miss Universe competition here in the early 2000s that I think that was the first time he'd been to Panama, and he was quite impressed by this little mini Dubai, mini Miami in Central America.
And there has been some sort of movement from the Panamanian government, hasn't there? There's been an audit started into that Hong Kong-owned company, CK Hutchinson's, that's at the centre of the row. Is that a sign they're moving towards America on this?
It could be. There is the Panamanians say officially, well, that audit was always going to happen, but I think this could be a window for some sort of deal, which is the sort of buzzword whenever anyone's talking about anything to do with Trump. The company is being audited. It in '97 got both ports, both by paying a pretty big upfront fee, and also by saying it will pay 10% of its profits to the Panamanian government. And whatever happened, one of the things you hear is people say, "Yeah, but Panama never really got so much money from that. Are these profits as low as the company says they might be, et cetera, et cetera?" Who knows the truth on that? And so certainly Hutchinson sort of says it's absolutely, transparent and has complied by every Panamanian law. But it does look like that may, as I say, be one way that they, lo and behold, we've decided to end that contract with Hutchison's. It's open again. And, Panama, of course, could make a whole lot of money if there was an international bid again to run those two ports.
So where does that leave Trump's claim to the Panama Canal? Do you think maybe people are getting ready to make a sort of quiet deal, or are we going to hear more bombastic claims from Trump, do you think, in the coming months?
It's very, very difficult to predict the way he goes. But in the last 24 hours, for example, he was utterly made some very, very sort of strong comments towards Colombia, saying that if it didn't take deportees, immediate 25% tariff, et cetera. Colombia backed down from that, but so to a certain extent, a bit did Trump. So I think negotiation is always possible. One of the things I've found here, I also was lucky enough to go to a reunion, by coincidence, the annual reunion of what are called the Zonians, the people who live or used to live in the canal or alongside the canal. Most of them Americans who then, after that deal was signed, went back to the United States, but sort of come back here like a high school reunion. They happen to be here. And a lot of them are Trump voters. And a lot of them have nostalgia about living in Panama at a time, when that zone was controlled by the United States. But I didn't find any single one of them, and I spoke to several of them, who said this is realistic that the United States would take it back. They all said, yeah, it looks, we're not, we can see the problem with the Chinese side of things, but realistically, 25 years after a handover, in a changed world, the United States coming back and taking the canal, that's sort of never going to happen, was the message I got from most of them.